of this research was. And when I initially started this, I guess it kind of shot a little too broad. So what it ended up being is kind of a 30,000-foot view of what laws were implemented over from trustee period up to early 20th century that, while not necessarily conservation in intent, they had the effect of conservation, just kind of the build up to it. So starting with the trustee period. So trustee colony was established 1732, turned over to the royal governors in about 1752. And during this period, the big kind of impact was the trustee garden that was established in 1734. Now, trustee garden, they had a lot of ambition and design, but wasn't very good in, I guess, implementation. It was 10 acres that was set aside in Savannah, and it had a twofold purpose. They were looking at the agricultural aspect as well as medicinal botanicals. Now, with the agricultural side, they had ambitious plans to grow crops that, like oranges or olives, grapes, different varieties of grapes for wine, kind of exotic subtropical and tropical crops that just did not grow in Savannah. And there were constant complaints of the gardens were neglected or the oranges would freeze during a spring frost. They kind of learned the hard way. It didn't really work. These were not crops native to the area. Even the grapes varieties that they brought in, they weren't working with local grapes. They were trying to bring ones from other areas. Now, on the botanical side of things, they were trying to grow medicinal plants, especially ones that were found in more Spanish colonies in South America. Things like Peruvian bark, found this picture of it, and some other ones. Peruvian bark was used as a fever-reducing herb, and also it later became used as anti-malarial. So they had kind of a medicinal aspect that they were looking at. Now, part of the reason that agriculture and botanical uses weren't really growing in the area was up until 1750, there were some major restrictions on land ownership, limiting 500 acres per person, and trustees weren't allowed to own land in the area. They're trying to limit these massive conglomerations of land and acreage, as well as restrictions on slavery. And those restrictions were lifted in 1750, and agriculture started to grow, especially as it moved into the royal colonial period. And under this, you start seeing a lot of plantations developing along the coastline. And in the process, there was a lot of massive forest clearing. Now, this had the effect of a lot of, dead trees and roughage and things thrown into the Savannah River, as well as silt from clearing the land, falling into the river. So this was the period that you started seeing the first acts passed to clear the Savannah River, purposely clear it. Usually the intent was to increase navigation, but also to allow for the free passage of fish. They mention that frequently, the free passage of fish to be able to go back up. Now, the intent clearly was for commerce and economics, but the effect was, keeping the natural species of fish and not over farming them. Okay, moving from that period up into the antebellum period, it's kind of a long period. There is a gap there because I wasn't able to find records yet from 1785 to 1799. But starting with 1799, when the General Assembly of Georgia started meeting, at first it was every year, then for a period every 2 years, and kind of back and forth. Pretty much every year from that point forward, you see multiple acts being passed saying we need to clear this river, we need to keep this river clear, we need to allow for the passage of fish and boats. And the main focus was on keeping things clear for navigation, but it kind of kept the environment of the river in its more natural state. It's kind of the early, what I would identify as the earliest efforts that had the effect of conservation of natural resources. Part of, you had a continuation of increase in plantations, especially the crops of indigo, cotton, and rice along the coast. But as cotton started to spread out across the Piedmont and upper western coastal plain areas, you saw a lot of soil loss and a lot of, I think I saw it was an average of 7.5 inches of topsoil loss where this was going was into the stream. So you start seeing even bigger increase in acts of we need to clean the rivers, we need to keep them clear for navigation, because one of the effects they're starting to notice was whenever it rained heavy, floods, water had nowhere to go because rivers weren't as deep. You had soil accumulating in the bottom of the rivers. So there's an increase in these acts every year. And first, it would just be for one, and then eventually you would see 5, 10 acts being passed in 1 year, one for each specific river was the general pattern. Okay, so from there, they also started about the 1820s, started seeing some acts passed that were restricting fishing. They moved from let's keep the waters clear for the fish to limiting fishing. And they mentioned specifically shad fish. I had to go look up what that was. It was a species I'd never heard of. And what they were doing, usually it was you weren't allowed to fish in this stream on Sundays or Mondays. And there would be fines for it. And then also hunting restrictions for deer, especially. So they started noticing that they needed to conserve some of these natural resources. It was with the intent of preserving an economic source, but the result, they're conserving nature. So conservation happening. And also saw some mentioning harvesting oysters and then also restricting hunting of turtles and terrapins. An act was passed in 1820 something. I'd have to look at my notes. And then I noticed in the acts of the Assembly of Georgia, all of these societies started popping up. And I listed the ones that I found in the 1820s and 30s usually. It's all these agricultural societies. Now, these societies were formed mostly to find ways to encourage agriculture, but in the process, some of these societies were focusing on how can we make it last longer and not just be in one area for a few years and have to move on, as previous farming practices had been. So you had different societies. You also started seeing state government offices being formed that had an effect on nature and conservation. First one I found, the Office of Topographical and Civil Engineer in 1819. And their purpose was basically survey the state of Georgia, kind of take a state of the land and figure out what the lay is, have some accurate maps drawn, where do we need to clean up rivers, and things like that. And then also in 1835, because of all these agricultural societies popping up, government office was formed, the Board of Agricultural and Rural Economy, with focus on improving agricultural practices in Georgia. Okay. And then I noticed through the acts of the Assembly of Georgia that during the Civil War period, not much was being passed. You'd occasionally see a hunting restriction act or a river cleanup act, but generally not much is being passed during that period. But then things started popping during the 1870s again. And that's when you had the Department of Agriculture formed in 1874, as well as the state geologists of the state of Georgia. And their purpose was supposed to be kind of survey the minerals and get accurate map of what type of soil there is around the state of Georgia and have more accurate maps. And part of this is because mining is increasing in Georgia, and a lot of mining companies were being incorporated in the 1870s as well. Then from there, started moving into more lumber industry. Now, at this point, there wasn't really any restrictions on lumber. You just start seeing an increase in lumber activity, especially in North Georgia, and then I found as well down in Okefenokee Swamp. Then the Okefenokee Swamp area had kind of its own interesting little story that the first lumber company that went there just kind of collapsed and didn't succeed. They sold it to the family of the original, I guess, head of that company, and then his family kept it, sold it to another family in 1901, and then it has a history we'll get into a little bit too. Now, the first real act that I found that was like a purposeful conservation act was the Weeks Act. Now, that's the national level, 1911, but then following that, other acts were passed in Georgia as well. Now, the Weeks Act established the U.S. Forest Service and the National Forest System. And then once that was established, you started seeing acreage bought up by the federal government as well. So this is when the federal government as well as state government started buying up land. So The first one, Gannett Land and Lumber Company, sold about 31,000 acres to the federal government. That later became part of the Chattahoochee National Forest. And then in 1917 was probably the first really big land purchase, 749,000 acres. Purchase created the Cherokee National Forest, redesignated the Chattahoochee National Forest in 1937. And back down the Okefenokee Swamp, the land is in the hands of a family, the Hebert family. And one of the things that they did was the son built a hunting cabin on an island in the Okefenokee, and it kind of became a little destination for people who style themselves kind of preservationists and people who would go out hunting, but as well as studying nature. And you start seeing a lot of people writing about the beauty of the Okefenokee in this period. Now, during this time, the Okefenokee Society was formed in 1918. It fell apart a few years later after the founder died, and their purpose was to try to get the government to buy the Okefenokee and turn it into a preserve of some kind. So this was one of the first efforts to create a preserve in Georgia. Georgia Society Naturalists kind of took up that cause in the late 20s, and then later on the federal government did buy the area. 1927, I found this was the first official area designated to be a state, later to be a state park, Indian Springs Reserve. And then the first kind of parks created in Georgia, it's kind of an explosion of them because of New Deal projects, is where the funding for these came from, creating jobs. So you had, and then a bunch of acts passed in the 1930s as well. So Georgia State Park System officially created in 1931, and then you had things happening later in the Georgia Soil Conservation Districts, and that changed into something later on. And then Georgia Department of Natural Resources created in 1937. And then back, kind of bringing back to Okefenokee, there had been a push to create it as a nature preserve, and they finally kind of got their wish with that. The federal government purchased almost 300,000 acres, and they turned it into a nature preserve, turned it over to the state of Georgia, and then the state of Georgia officially bought the land back in the 50s, I believe it was. So kind of the whole purpose of this project was to show that although you didn't really see purposeful conservation laws being passed until the 20th century, all these acts leading up to it, mostly in the 19th century, some efforts early in the 18th, was more that the intent was for economic benefit for the local people, especially along the coast. But the effect was that they were conserving natural resources, and it was kind of a buildup until you had official conservation laws passed in the 1920s and so. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so our next presenter is going to be Emma Kiser. Emma Kiser is a doctoral candidate in history at the University of Kentucky, whose research focuses on old growth forests in the Southern Appalachians. She is a founding member of the Environmental History Working Group and has served in leadership positions with the Appalachian Research Community and the Environmental Humanities Initiative at UK. Emma's talk is Protecting Old Growth Hope Spots in North Georgia, from Cooper Creek to Grassy Mountain.
All right, hey everybody. I'm going to start off by playing a little audio, and we'll see if it works okay. I don't know if y'all could hear it, but it was it was recording from an old growth forest and just some water sounds. So I just like to start with that. My dissertation, this presentation is a work in progress. About part of my dissertation My overall, my dissertation is about 4 old growth forests, 2 in eastern Kentucky and 2 in North Georgia. So I'm just going to talk about the 2 Georgia campaigns, one that occurred in 1959 to protect Cooper Creek, and a more recent but long-growing campaign to protect old growth on areas of Grassy Mountain, as well as other unprotected special areas in the Chattahoochee-Oconee National Forest. I might have clicked something when I was trying to do the sound. Okay, thank you. Great. Changing up here, I apologize. I had clicked something. I clicked that earlier when I was trying to get the sound, and then something popped up.
Okay, I think we'll get it.
Are you ready?
And
Maybe the audio just like froze.
Let's see. I think. Let's try this. Sorry.
No.
Okay, I think.
So just which one?
Down.
Just down. Okay, great, thanks. All right. So yes, here is the Chattahoochee National Forest. Grassy Mountain is on the western edge of the big patch of green, and Cooper Creek is sort of more in the central part. Cooper Creek is in Union County. Grassy Mountain is in Murray County. So these forests were long stewarded by indigenous people and belonged to the Cherokee Nation when the U.S. government dispossessed Cherokee people from their land and deported them to what is now Oklahoma. And just to give you a sense of the place, Cooper Creek is the picture on the top, and Grassy Mountain with some boulder fields and is on the bottom. So I'm defining old growth forests as forests with old trees that have had minimal human disturbance, so they have not been industrially logged. Old growth forests received national attention last year when the Biden administration announced an executive order instructing agencies to define and inventory old growth and mature forests on federal lands. This was a wise move. Old growth forests have proved critical for their biodiversity ecosystem services, such as providing clean water and air, soil health and fertility, habitats for endemic and endangered species, and their social and economic and cultural roles. Old trees and mature soils store high levels of carbon and are crucial for climate mitigation. These forests are rare and far from secure. While few old growth forest tracts remain across much of North America, and in the Appalachians, old woods are even more rare. Despite a long history of old growth forest defense, we have only 0.5% of old growth forests remaining in the eastern U.S. In the Appalachians, remaining tracts are especially precious. Appalachian forests are some of the most biodiverse in the world. The evolution of these ancient mountains has provided conditions for a stunning array of genetically diverse animals, plants, and forest communities. Despite their vital relevance, Appalachian old growth forests continue to be threatened by destructive forces. The wood's abundant resources have sustained indigenous people for millennia. White and Black newcomers learned how to survive in the Appalachian forest from Native Americans. Practices such as foraging American chestnuts, ginseng, and other plants, as well as hunting and fishing, sustained and supplemented Appalachian households. However, a massive wave of industrial cutting transformed the central and southern Appalachian region beginning in 1890 through the 1930s. After exhausting the Great Lakes area forests, capitalists and railroads ventured into Appalachian terrain with an unsustainable cut out and get out business model. Historian Ronald L. Lewis referred to it as the skinning of the mountains, made possible by railroads, heavy steam equipment, and other technologies. Deforestation resulted in erosion, flooding, waterways destruction and damage, and uncontrollable fires that threatened nearby communities and further degraded ecosystems. A conservation movement grew out of concern for the disappearing forests, and in 1911, the federal government passed the Weeks Act, enabling it to purchase eastern lands to protect watersheds and establish national forests. Conservation did not necessarily mean that old-growth forests were safe from harvest. The Forest Service historically deliberately cut old trees in national forests, considering them wasteful, decadent, or overmature, to make space for commercially valuable trees to grow. Logging on national forests increased during World War II and spiked again in the 80s. And in the 90s, when it seemed there was little hope for old growth remaining in the Appalachian Mountains, professional and citizen researchers began looking for and documenting remaining old growth forest fragments in the eastern US. So for my research, I asked several questions. How have some tracts been spared while most Appalachian forests were cut? What have been the barriers to old growth forest protection? How did a few campaigns achieve some success? What can we learn from the remarkably few success stories? I'm using an analytical framework of hope spots to link my project together in a way I found useful and inspiring. The concept of hope spots is borrowed from marine oceanographer Sylvia Earle's mission to protect biodiverse marine areas that are critical to the health of the ocean. And I'm using a terrestrial version of hope spots. This image of a tree as a hope spot shows the different functions old growth forests perform. And like the ocean hope spots, I'm arguing that old growth forests need to be protected. Their destruction will lead to a loss of biodiversity on multiple scales, local, regional, and planetary. They're places of wildlife refuge, ecosystem restoration, and regeneration. And as I mentioned, climate mitigation. I also like the framework of hope spots because with hope comes action. And just to go to my North Georgia hope spots, I just want to highlight that for both Grassy Mountain and the Cooper Creek area, before the Forest Service acquired these areas in the 19-teens through the 1930s, the majority of the land was owned by lumber companies. And also Cooper Creek has a couple hundred acres of old growth remaining, and Grassy Mountain has just under 2,000. So they're very different sites. Cooper Creek, its old growth forest drew scientific and popular attention in 1959 because of the efforts of Georgia State College ecology professor Charles H. Wharton. He discovered that the Forest Service planned to build a road down Cooper Creek and open up the forest for timber harvests. Wharton and other scientists had been using the area for educational and research purposes. He galvanized a significant campaign to protect Cooper Creek from being cut by the Forest Service, in which he emphasized its old growth characteristics. This article by the AJC magazine demonstrates this emphasis. The January 1959 article was called "Giant Trees Live in a Wild Primeval Forest," and describes Cooper Creek as appearing to be the last primeval forest in the Georgia mountains. Wharton asked educators and naturalists to write the Forest Service to protest the logging. Scientists from Emory, Vanderbilt, Wesleyan, University of Georgia, local organizations like Men's Garden Club of Atlanta and the Georgia Federation of Women's Club wrote the Forest Service. They all remarked on the rarity of old growth forests, especially in the Southeast. Even Georgia House of Representatives and Georgia's U.S. senators supported Wharton. It took a little while for the Forest Service to be persuaded, but they did find the Cooper Creek. They denied that it was old growth at first, and then they eventually were persuaded that it had merit. by April, they announced that they would protect Cooper Creek. It became designated as a scenic area, and this is a photo of the dedication ceremony, which Charles Wharton is the standing row. He's the second on the left. It also has a few Forest Service staff and a member of the Atlanta Men's Garden Club, a local landowner, a reverend, a congressman, and a judge in the picture. So this case helps demonstrate that Appalachian old growth found champions even in the post-war period, which is seldom seen as a strong period of environmental protection. Just to shift to Grassy Mountain, the identification of old growth on Grassy happened in stages. It's part of a larger effort to protect special areas across Georgia's national forests. In the 1980s, a forester, Ron Stevens, documented several areas of old growth on Grassy. And in the 2000s, an ecologist and other grassroots activists with Georgia Forest Watch searched for unprotected old growth in the Chattahoochee National Forest. They found just under 2,000 acres of old growth on Grassy Mountain. Most of the land had been owned by the Connesaw River Lumber Company in the 19-teens until the Forest Service acquired it in the 1930s. And this company logged along the Connesaw River and its tributaries. And here's a picture of a logging operation in the Jacks River area, which is now the Cohutta Wilderness area. Grassy Mountain is just outside of the Cohutta Wilderness area. So why were areas of Grassy Mountain spared? The reasons seem to be more mysterious than Cooper Creek. Based on records as well as conversations I've had with ecologists and foresters, there is possibly a combination of reasons that have to do with accessibility and Grassy's steep terrain. Just so that it's a work in progress. There's still lots of remaining questions I have, but I'm just trying to wrap this up and just talk about the protection status of the two forests. The Grassy Mountain and Cooper Creek are managed by the Forest Service according to the 2004 Forest Management Plan, and it is so they're managed. The old growth is managed according to specific practices where it's designed to maintain its old growth status. So there's it's highly restricted with cutting. But this level of protection is contingent upon the next forest plan. So it's not permanently preserved or protected. Despite the many ways people have sought to protect old growth forests, Appalachian old growth forests are still some of the most vulnerable. So I welcome any questions and comments and feedback, and I have a lot of people to thank.